When Donald Trump announced he would hit Canadian dairy with a 250% tariff, he framed it as a decisive blow, a show of strength, a message that the United States would no longer tolerate what he called unfair treatment of American farmers. The logic sounded simple. Match Canada's tariffs dollar for dollar, threaten food exports, force Ottawa to the table. Trump believed food was leverage, that Canada, dependent on access to the American market, would fold under pressure. But what followed was not capitulation. It was something far more dangerous for the United States. Instead of bending, Canada walked away, quietly, methodically, permanently. Within months, supply chains that had existed for decades began to unravel. Canadian buyers stopped waiting for Washington to calm down. They started signing contracts elsewhere, Europe, Asia, Latin America. And while Trump declared victory in speeches, America's second-largest agricultural export market was slipping out of reach. This was the moment the trade war crossed a line, from political theater into structural damage. Because once food trade is disrupted, it does not reset, it rewires. The foundation of Trump's threat rested on a claim repeated so often it became accepted truth, that Canada was crushing American dairy farmers with a brutal 250% tariff. What was rarely mentioned is how those tariffs actually work. Canada's dairy system uses tariff rate quotas. The high tariffs only apply after imports exceed a fixed quota. Below that threshold, American dairy enters Canada tariff-free. And here is the critical detail. The United States has never come close to filling those quotas. According to calculations from the U.S. dairy industry itself, the average quota fill rate was just 26.72%. That means nearly 3/4 of potential dairy exports faced zero tariffs. In practical terms, no one was paying 250%. The tariff existed on paper, not in reality. But facts were irrelevant. Rhetoric mattered more. Trump continued to brand Canadian dairy policy as economic abuse and escalated his threats. Agriculture became a political cudgel, not a sector built on long-term trust, but a weapon to apply pressure. What Trump failed to grasp was this. Threatening food exports does not just hurt the target country, it forces that country to eliminate dependence entirely. And once alternatives are built, they do not disappear when the shouting stops. As the rhetoric intensified, Canadian policymakers ran the numbers. The results were alarming. Nearly 75% of Canada's food and beverage exports were going to the United States. That level of concentration wasn't efficiency, it was exposure. Trump wasn't just threatening tariffs, he was threatening food security. And so Canada reframed the problem. The issue was no longer how to negotiate with Washington. The issue was how to remove Washington from the equation. The response was not emotional, it was strategic. A federal analysis outlined a clear objective: shift $12 billion in food and beverage exports away from the U.S. market within a few years, not decades, years. The plan had 3 pillars. First, increase interprovincial trade, replacing U.S. imports with Canadian supply. Second, fully activate Canada's existing free trade agreements, which covered 51 countries and 2/3 of global GDP, but had been underused. Third, aggressively pursue new buyers in Europe and Asia, markets that valued stability over political theater. This was not retaliation, it was insulation. Trump's threats didn't break Canada's system, they exposed its single point of failure and provided the political will to eliminate it. By the time Washington realized what was happening, the pivot was already underway, and it would not be reversed. Canada's response was not improvisation, it was execution. With political cover created by Trump's threats, Canadian agricultural planners moved quickly to implement a diversification strategy that had existed on paper for years. The goal was blunt: remove U.S. leverage from Canada's food system. The first step was internal. Provinces were pushed to buy from one another instead of sourcing from across the border. Barriers to interprovincial trade that had lingered for decades were suddenly treated as a national security issue, not a bureaucratic inconvenience. Analysts estimated this alone could replace $2.6 billion in U.S.-sourced food imports. The second step was external. Canada already had one of the world's most extensive trade networks, with 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries. The problem was not access, it was complacency. For years, selling to the U.S. had been easier than activating distant markets. Trump ended that comfort. Prepared foods, vegetable oils, animal feed, meat products, entire categories that sent over 90% of exports south were flagged for redirection. Export agencies were reoriented, financing followed, logistics capacity expanded. Economists at major Canadian banks projected that aggressive diversification could increase Canada's share of global agricultural exports by 30% within a decade, adding tens of billions in new trade. This was the critical shift. Canada was no longer reacting to American pressure. It was designing a system that would function without the United States. Europe was the first door to swing open. The Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement had been in place for years, eliminating tariffs on 98% of Canadian goods entering the EU. What it lacked was urgency. Trump supplied it. As Washington threatened agricultural trade, Canadian producers began targeting Europe with intensity. Grocery chains, distributors, and processors that had once treated Canadian products as niche alternatives now saw them as strategic supply. A Quebec dairy producer reported sales to Europe rising by more than 30% as retailers committed to featuring Canadian milk and cheese. Beef and pork shipments expanded into Germany and Poland. Seafood from Atlantic Canada flowed into Spain, Portugal, and Italy. The timing could not have been better. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered Europe's assumptions about food security. Traditional east-west supply lines for grain, vegetable oil, and fertilizer were suddenly unstable. European buyers began prioritizing suppliers that offered reliability over price alone. Canada fit the profile perfectly: politically stable, rule-abiding, and predictable. Multi-year contracts followed. Infrastructure investments followed those contracts. Cold storage, shipping routes, compliance systems, all were built around non-American supply chains. By the time Washington noticed the scale of the shift, European buyers were locked in. This was no longer diversification, it was displacement. If Europe reduced Canada's dependence on the United States, Asia eliminated it. Southeast and South Asia are projected to account for over 30% of global food consumption growth in the coming decade. These markets combine rising incomes, growing populations, and increasing demand for high-quality imports. Canada had access. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership already opened doors to Japan, Vietnam, and other Asia-Pacific economies. Additional negotiations with ASEAN members, India, and Indonesia were underway. What had been missing was urgency. Trump provided it. Canadian wheat shipments to Indonesia surged. Peas and lentils found sustained demand in India. Canola, once heavily dependent on North American buyers, began flowing into Asian markets previously dominated by U.S. suppliers. The increase was not marginal. In multiple categories, Canadian agricultural exports to Asia jumped by double digits within months. Crucially, these were not opportunistic shipments. They were long-term partnerships built on reliability, a reputation the United States was rapidly losing. Asian buyers were not just purchasing food, they were purchasing stability. Canada could offer something Washington no longer could: assurance that trade would not be disrupted by political theatrics. At that point, the transformation became irreversible. Once supply chains are built, contracts signed, and trust established, markets do not revert. Canada was no longer diversifying away from the United States, it was replacing it. While Canada was opening new markets, American farmers were losing one they had always taken for granted. Canada is the second largest destination for U.S. agricultural exports, absorbing roughly $28 billion in farm goods in a typical year. Baked goods, fresh vegetables, fruits, dairy, and beef flowed north through supply chains that had operated smoothly for generations. Then those chains began to break. Within months of escalating trade tensions, U.S. agricultural exports to Canada fell sharply. The decline was not dramatic enough to dominate headlines, but it was persistent and accelerating. Dairy producers were hit first. Canadian buyers, unwilling to risk political disruption, turned to European suppliers. Beef followed. Long-standing relationships with U.S. ranchers were replaced by contracts with Australia, Brazil, and Argentina. Once those relationships were established, there was no reason to return. The damage spread outward. Border region farms supplying Canadian processors saw orders shrink. Food manufacturers that relied on Canadian demand faced excess capacity. Even domestic prices were affected as surplus production flooded the U.S. market. This was not a temporary downturn, it was a loss of access, and the farmers most affected were the very people Trump claimed to be defending. The contradiction at the heart of Trump's strategy became impossible to ignore when fertilizer entered the equation. Canada is the largest supplier of potash to the United States, a critical input for American agriculture. Without it, crop yields fall, costs rise, entire planting seasons are jeopardized. Yet potash was included in Trump's tariff threats. At the height of planting season, the prospect of a 25% tariff on Canadian potash sent shockwaves through farm country. Input costs would spike overnight, hitting margins that were already under pressure from lost export markets. Behind the scenes, emergency lobbying began. U.S. agricultural officials urged the White House to step back. Eventually, the proposed tariff was reduced, not because of strategic restraint, but because the damage would have been immediate and catastrophic. The episode revealed the asymmetry Trump had missed. Canada exported goods to the U.S. that were difficult to replace. The U.S. exported goods to Canada that could be substituted if buyers were pushed hard enough. Trump believed he was exercising power. In reality, he was exposing dependence. And once dependence is exposed, leverage disappears. The trade conflict triggered a psychological shift inside Canada that went far beyond tariffs. Food was no longer viewed as just another commodity, it became a matter of national security. Buy Canadian campaigns spread rapidly. Grocery chains reoriented shelves to emphasize domestic sourcing. Government procurement policies prioritized Canadian suppliers. Consumers responded. Polling showed a majority of Canadians actively avoiding American products, particularly among younger buyers. This was not symbolic protest, it was behavioral change. Farmers adjusted accordingly. Production expanded to meet domestic demand. Processing facilities retooled to serve Canadian and non-U.S. markets. What economists call import substitution, usually slow and inefficient, accelerated at unprecedented speed. The logic was simple. Security outweighs efficiency. Once that principle takes hold, price advantages and convenience lose relevance. Trust and control become the deciding factors. International buyers took note. Watching the United States weaponize food trade, countries began asking whether dependence on American agriculture was worth the risk. Canada offered an alternative, one built on stability rather than threats. The damage to American agriculture was not cyclical, it was structural. Canadian buyers who invested in European, Asian, and domestic supply chains had no incentive to return. Contracts were signed, infrastructure was built, marketing strategies were realigned around local sourcing. Reversing that shift would require abandoning sunk costs and rebuilding trust, a process measured in decades, not election cycles. Meanwhile, American farmers faced a harsher reality. Their second-largest export market had shrunk, their reputation for reliability had been compromised, and international buyers now viewed U.S. agricultural products as politically risky. Trump believed food could be used as a weapon. What he actually did was teach the world how to live without American food. That lesson will not be unlearned. The empty warehouses in the Midwest, waiting for orders that no longer come, are not anomalies. They are evidence of a permanent reordering of global agriculture. Canada absorbed the shock, adapted, and emerged more resilient. American farmers paid the price, and that, not the speeches, not the slogans, is the true legacy of the trade war Trump started with food.